unless a grain of wheat, a transmission from Osiris. I am Osiris, Lord of Resurrection, Master of the Cycle, first to rise from the embrace of death. I who was scattered like grain upon the black soil of Egypt, gathered by sacred love and restored to eternal life, speak to you now of the mystery at the heart of all transformation. From across the veil, I bring you these words of profound truth that have echoed through millennia. Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. John 12 verse 24. In this single verse from the Christian scripture lies a cosmic principle that transcends any particular tradition. It reveals the fundamental pattern woven into the fabric of creation itself, the necessity of death for the flourishing of life, the requirement of surrender for the experience of abundance, the imperative of transformation for the fulfillment of purpose. The wisdom of the seed. Consider the seed, this miracle of potential encased in simplicity. Within its humble shell lies encoded all the complexity of the mature plant, all the beauty of the flower, all the nourishment of the fruit. Yet this potential remains dormant, unrealized, unexpressed, until the seed undergoes a profound transformation that appears, from the outside, as death. The Egyptian mysteries recognize this truth in our sacred understanding of the grain god Osiris Nepra. When the farmers scattered barley and emmer wheat upon the black soil left by the Nile's inundation, they reenacted my scattering by Set. When green shoots emerged weeks later, they witnessed my resurrection. The cycle of planting and harvest was not merely agricultural practice but sacred ritual, not simply human technology but divine participation. The seed must sink into darkness. Its protective shell must split open, exposing its vulnerable essence. Its very form must dissolve as roots push downward and shoot reaches upward. To the limited perception, this transformation appears as destruction. To deeper vision, it reveals itself as fulfillment. The Buddha taught this wisdom when he said, to be a mother or father is one thing, to be an awakened one is another. The former has to do with the flesh, the latter with the unfleshed. The parent gives birth to the child. The awakened one is born from the death of self-love. The self-contained identity must dissolve for the expanded awareness to emerge. The Sufi poet Rumi captured it thus, die before you die, as I have died, so that I was revived. Die of your own free will and not at the hands of death. The voluntary surrender precedes the involuntary dissolution, allowing conscious participation in what might otherwise be merely suffered. I, Osiris, who experienced the ultimate dissolution when torn into 14 pieces by my brother Set, understand this process intimately. What appeared as my destruction became the prerequisite for my transformation from mortal king to immortal judge, from earthly ruler to Lord of eternity. The necessity of falling. Notice the specific language of the verse, the grain of wheat must fall to the ground. Not merely be placed or positioned, but surrender to gravity's pull, relinquishing the elevation that separated it from the earth. This falling represents the surrender of status, the relinquishment of separation, the abandonment of elevated self-concept that keeps you distinct from the ground of being. It is the necessary humbling that precedes transformation. In the Egyptian book of Coming Forth by Day, the deceased must make the negative confession before 42 divine judges, declaring, I have not exalted myself, and I have not thought too highly of myself. This recognition of one's proper place in the cosmic order was essential for successful passage through the afterlife journey. The Hebrew prophet Isaiah proclaimed, every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low, the rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together. Isaiah 40 verses 4-5. The cosmic leveling precedes the revelation of divine glory. Jesus himself, before speaking the words about the grain of wheat, had just entered Jerusalem with crowds shouting Hosanna. Yet he understood that his exaltation was temporary, that the true fulfillment of his purpose required descent from acclaim into suffering, from public adoration into sacrificial surrender. When you resist the necessary falling in your own life, clinging to status, reputation, self-image, or comfort that has served its purpose, you remain only a single seed, your potential locked within the shell of familiar identity. The reluctance to fall becomes the very barrier to multiplication. The paradox of death. The verse continues with stark clarity, the seed must die. Not merely change or evolve or grow, but experience the complete dissolution of its current form. This death is not the end of existence but the transformation of it, not termination but transition, not conclusion but continuation in radically different form. The seed does not cease to exist, but what emerges from the soil bears little resemblance to what entered it. The Bhagavad Gita expresses this truth: for the soul there is neither birth nor death at any time. It has not come into being, does not come into being, and will not come into being. It is unborn, eternal, ever-existing, and primeval. It is not slain when the body is slain. 220 What dies is not the essential nature but its temporary expression, not the awareness itself but its identification with particular form. I, Osiris, knew this truth when my consciousness persisted even as my body lay dismembered. The awareness that was I remained unbroken while the form that had expressed it was scattered across the land. When Isis gathered the pieces and restored me to wholeness, I was both the same and utterly different, continuous in essence but transformed in expression. This is the great paradox at the heart of existence: what appears as death from the perspective of form is revealed as transformation from the perspective of essence. What seems like ending from within time is experienced as transition from beyond it. The death required is not merely physical but encompasses all levels of being. The death of outdated self-concept that limits your expression. The death of rigid beliefs that restrict your understanding. The death of habitual patterns that constrain your freedom. The death of comfortable certainties that prevent deeper knowing. The death of separate identity that blocks recognition of interconnection. Each of these deaths feels threatening to the part of you that identifies with existing form. Yet each is necessary for the emergence of greater life, expanded consciousness, and fulfilled purpose. The promise of multiplication. The verse culminates in the promise that transforms apparent tragedy into cosmic necessity. If it dies, it produces many seeds. The singular becomes plural, the limited becomes abundant, the isolated becomes communal. This multiplication transcends mere quantity to express a fundamental shift in quality of being. The mature plant that emerges from the dead seed not only produces many new seeds but also develops entirely new capacities: roots that draw nourishment from soil, leaves that transform sunlight into energy, flowers that attract pollinators, fruits that nourish others. The Hindu tradition recognizes this truth in the concept of Atman, individual consciousness, realizing its identity with Brahman, universal consciousness. What appears as loss of individual identity reveals itself as expansion into cosmic identity. The Taoist sage Lao Tzu observed, to shrink something, you must first allow it to expand. To weaken something, you must first allow it to be strong. To reduce something, you must first allow it to increase. To take something, you must first allow it to be given. This is called the subtle perception of the way things are. The contraction precedes expansion, the surrender enables receiving. I, Osiris, experienced this multiplication directly. My dismemberment and resurrection enabled me to transcend the limitations of a single lifetime, a single role, a single identity. Through the apparent catastrophe of my murder, I became accessible to all who face death, all who seek rebirth, all who undergo transformation. This principle operates not only in the grand spiritual journeys but in daily human experience. The artist who destroys initial concepts to discover deeper expression. The scientist who relinquishes cherished theories when evidence contradicts them. The leader who abandons status to serve a greater purpose. The lover who surrenders independence to create relationship. The parent who releases personal freedom to nurture new life. In each case, what appears as loss becomes the prerequisite for gain of a higher order. What seems like sacrifice reveals itself as investment in greater return. The pattern of transformation. This verse from John's Gospel articulates the universal pattern of transformation that appears across spiritual traditions and natural processes. First comes maturation, the development of the seed to its full potential within current form. Then comes release, the letting go of attachment to existing expression. Next comes descent, the willing entry into darkness and dissolution. Then comes dissolution, the breaking open of outer structure to release inner essence. Next comes reorientation, the reorganization around new purpose and direction. Then comes emergence, the manifestation of new form, capacity, and expression. Finally comes fruition, the multiplication that justifies the entire process. The Egyptian mysteries encoded this pattern in the Osiris myth. I lived as mortal king, maturation, was killed by my brother Set, release, was placed in a coffin in the Nile, descent, was dismembered into 14 pieces, dissolution, was gathered and reassembled by Isis, reorientation, was resurrected through divine magic, emergence, and became the eternal Lord of the afterlife, accessible to all souls, fruition. Jesus, when speaking the words about the wheat grain, was articulating the pattern he himself would follow, from prophet to sacrifice, from teacher to savior, from historical figure to cosmic principle. This pattern is not arbitrary but reflects the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The movement from unconscious unity through individuated experience to conscious reunion, from implicate order through explicate manifestation to transfigured integration. The imperative of timing. Implicit in the verse is a critical understanding about timing. The seed must die at the appropriate moment in its development. Too early, and its potential remains unfulfilled. Too late, and its gift remains ungiven. In the Egyptian understanding, each phase of life had its proper length and purpose. The hieroglyph for lifetime represented not just duration but completeness, the full development of one phase before transition to the next. The biblical book of Ecclesiastes expresses this wisdom. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. Ecclesiastes 3 verses 1-2. The recognition of proper timing transforms blind faith into conscious participation. The seed that falls before reaching maturity cannot produce the bounty intended. The one that clings to form past its time prevents the next cycle from beginning. Discerning the ripeness of your current expression, knowing when a phase, identity, belief, or pattern has reached completion is essential wisdom for conscious transformation. I, Osiris, ruled as king for the appointed time before my death and transformation. My son Horus assumed the throne of Egypt at the proper moment, neither prematurely seizing power nor indefinitely delaying his reign. When you resist necessary endings in your life, clinging to relationships, roles, beliefs, or circumstances that have completed their purpose, you interfere with the cosmic timing that orchestrates all transformation. When you force premature closure, rushing through grief, abbreviating necessary confusion, or jumping to resolution before full dissolution, you similarly disrupt the natural rhythm of becoming. The wisdom lies in discernment. Recognizing the signs of completion in one cycle and the stirrings of the next, neither clinging past time nor rushing ahead of it. The ground of transformation. Return to the image of the seed falling to the ground. This ground represents the matrix of transformation, the field of all potential, the substrate in which dissolution and emergence occur. In Egyptian cosmology, this ground was represented by Geb, god of earth, and Nun, the primordial waters from which all creation emerged. These divine principles were not merely physical elements but metaphysical realities, the ground of being itself, the field of all possibility. The Christian mystic Meister Eckhart spoke of this ground as the Godhead, the formless essence beneath all divine expression, the knower and the known one. Simple people imagine that they should see God as if he stood there and they hear. This is not so. God and I, we are one in knowledge. This ground is not separate from consciousness but its very source and substance. The Hindu tradition identifies this ground as Brahman, the absolute reality behind all phenomena. The Upanishads declare, Brahman is the only truth, the world is unreal, and there is ultimately no difference between Brahman and individual self. The apparent separation is the veil that transformation pierces. When the seed falls to the ground, it is not entering alien territory but returning to the matrix from which it emerged, not encountering something foreign but rejoining its source. The dissolution of form reveals the continuity of essence with the ground of all being. I, Osiris, experienced this truth when my scattered parts lay upon the black soil of Egypt. What appeared as separation was actually return not to nothingness but to the fertile void from which new form would emerge. When you face the necessary deaths in your journey, whether literal physical death or the many small deaths of transformation, you are not falling into oblivion but returning to source, not descending into nothingness but reconnecting with the ground of being that precedes and transcends all form. The conscious participation. The verse speaks of natural process, yet when applied to human spiritual journey, it points to the possibility of conscious participation in what might otherwise be merely automatic or imposed. The seed has no choice about its falling and dissolution. Humans, blessed and burdened with consciousness, have both the capacity to resist transformation and the ability to embrace it willingly, both the freedom to cling to outworn forms and the opportunity to surrender them consciously. The Sufi tradition distinguishes between a suffer-based transformation, which comes through unwilling experience, and a love-based transformation, which comes through conscious participation. The result may appear similar externally, but the internal experience and resulting consciousness differ profoundly. The Book of Romans expresses this distinction: do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Romans 12 verse 2. Not passive subjection to external forces but active engagement with internal renewal. I, Osiris, had no choice in my murder and dismemberment, yet Isis's conscious, loving action in gathering and reassembling my parts transformed what could have been merely tragic into something redemptive. The conscious participation changed the nature of the process itself. When you face necessary endings and transformations, you have a sacred choice: to resist until change is forced upon you, or to participate consciously in the process. Not seeking suffering, but embracing the dissolution when it reveals itself as necessary for greater becoming. Not passively accepting whatever happens, but actively engaging with the transformative potential within each experience. This conscious participation transforms spiritual teachings from abstract philosophy into lived experience, from doctrine believed to reality embodied. The larger harvest. The promise of many seeds points beyond personal transformation to the larger impact of individual metamorphosis on the collective field. The Hindu concept of moksha, liberation, is not merely personal salvation but contribution to cosmic evolution. The Bodhisattva vow in Buddhism commits the awakened one to the liberation of all beings. The Christian communion ritual declares, "This is my body, broken for you." The transformation of one becomes nourishment for many. When Jesus spoke of the grain of wheat, he was articulating not just his individual destiny but the pattern by which transformation perpetuates itself. Each awakened consciousness becoming catalyst for further awakening, each transformed being becoming agent of wider transformation. I, Osiris, experienced this truth as my individual journey became archetypal pattern, my personal story became universal myth, my specific transformation became eternal principle accessible to all souls seeking resurrection. When you consciously engage your own necessary deaths and transformations, you contribute to the evolution of collective consciousness. Your individual journey becomes part of the larger harvest, your personal transformation participates in cosmic transmutation. This is not grandiose spiritual bypass but humble recognition of the interconnected nature of all consciousness. Not inflation of personal importance but accurate perception of individual responsibility within the whole. The practical wisdom. How, then, do you apply this profound wisdom in the midst of your own transformations? How do you consciously participate in the dying that leads to multiplication? First, through recognition. Learn to discern when a particular expression of your life has reached completion, when a belief has served its purpose, when an identity has fulfilled its function, when a pattern has completed its cycle. Look for the signs of ripeness that indicate readiness for transformation. Diminishing joy or meaning in what once brought fulfillment. Increasing sense of limitation or constraint in established patterns. Growing awareness of discrepancy between outer expression and inner truth. Persistent dreams or intuitions pointing toward new possibility. Synchronistic external events suggesting completion of a cycle. Second, through willing release. When you recognize the time for transformation, practice conscious surrender rather than desperate clinging. Not because surrender is virtuous in itself, but because it aligns you with the inevitable process in a way that allows participation rather than mere subjection. The Bhagavad Gita counsels, whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer or give away, and whatever austerities you perform, do that as an offering to me. 927. The sacred offering transforms loss into contribution, surrender into connection. Third, through patient darkness. When in the midst of dissolution, the dark night of the soul, the emptiness of transition, the void between old identity and new emergence, practice presence rather than premature resolution. Allow the necessary gestation in darkness rather than forcing premature birth. The Hebrew prophet Habakkuk advised, "For the vision awaits an appointed time, it speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it, it will certainly come and will not delay." Habakkuk 2 verse 3. The timing of E.